All right, we're starting, finally. Can everybody hear me? All right. I want to welcome you all to the Econ Department's first provocative lecture of the fall 2015 semester, and I want to compliment you on navigating the ridiculously idiotic obstacle course that the university has set up for our benefit. I have a few administrative remarks before I introduce our speaker. Most of you should have picked up a sign-up sheet before arriving, a survey. If you can please leave that on the box, on the table outside when you depart, we would much appreciate it. This event is sponsored by donations from our donors and the Institute for Humane Studies, and the sign-up sheets help facilitate our fundraising for these events. The next provocative lecture is scheduled for Monday, October 19th, same location, so now you know all know how to get here. Same time. The speaker is Stephanie Hoff-Balk. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that name correctly. She's from the Mercatus Center, and she's going to talk about the vital role of private efforts in recovery from the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Afterwards, we're having our standard barstool meeting at Flames, and you're all welcome to join us for beer and pizza and hopefully some interesting discussion. So it's my pleasure to introduce James Grant, the founder and editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer. He has written many books on finance and financial history, including a biography of Bernard Baruch. He's been on several television programs, including 60 Minutes, The Charlie Rose Show, CBS Evening News, and had a 10-year stint on Wall Street Week. His articles have appeared in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Affairs. He earned a master's degree in international relations from Columbia University, began his career in journalism at the Baltimore Sun, and then years later joined the staff of Barron's, where he originated the Current Yield column. Tonight he is going to be discussing his latest book, The Forgotten Depression, 1921, The Crash That Cured Itself. The title of the talk is The Depression That Was Not So Great. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to James Grant.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, and good evening. Well, I had a harrowing drive coming here this evening. My driver had only had his license for 3 years, and he had no idea how to work the windshield wipers. But I am glad to be here indeed. In fact, both of us are. My book and I are thrilled to be here. In the 4 hours given to me this evening, I thought I'd tell you conciseness is one of the great virtues of oratory. So once upon a time, let me tell you about the historical bit, and perhaps we can talk, if you like, about contemporary finance and what is going on Wall Street. But to begin with the history, once upon a time in the early 20th century, there was a depression, a deflationary depression. Unemployment reached the double digits and farm incomes collapsed. Industrial production plunged, and the Dow was nearly sawed in half. From top to bottom, peak to trough, America's last governmentally unmedicated business cycle downturn lasted for a year and a half, 18 months. So the question before the House is why it ever ended. The fiscal response to this crisis was to balance the budget. And the monetary response was actually to raise interest rates, punishingly high rates they were even before adjusting for the level of prices. Yet, as I say, the Depression ended. It was Adam Smith's invisible hand, or Friedrich Hayek's price mechanism, I think, that performed the economic healing. So my mission this evening is first to describe what happened during the final year of Woodrow Wilson's administration and the opening months of Warren G. Harding's, and second to relate those long ago occurrences to the present day. Now, conscientious historians are at pains to separate present and past, as well they might be, to block out the attitudes and prejudices of today from their perception of yesteryear's events. I confess that I undertook this project in response to contemporary events. In 2008, the Great Depression of the 1930s monopolized the market in historical analogy. Policymakers constantly invoked the 1930s with reference to the crisis of the mangled mortgages and combusting banks. No intervention was too great to forestall a repeat of that calamity, they said. Thus, the drive to stimulate, to print money, to spend it, to regulate. And we are still being stimulated 7 years after the trouble started. As far as I know, not one senior policymaker invoked the 1920-1921 affair on the other side of the stimulus argument. You may say, many have said, that 1921 was a long time ago, and so it was. Then again, so was 1931. And you may observe that the world has changed since 1921, as it has since 1931. I submit that in respect to the study of economic history, the 1920s are just as deserving as the decades that followed them. As Amity Shlaes reminds us in her book, The Forgotten Man, the 1930s did no honor to American public policy. Monetary manipulation and heavy taxation, punitive regulation, public work spending, and on failed to restore the Harding-Coolidge prosperity. So I turn my attention to the decade that roared. Now, they say that the past is a foreign country. In monetary, banking, and regulatory arrangements, the 1920s seem especially alien. 95 years ago, the dollar was defined as a weight of gold, and the shareholders of a nationally chartered bank were responsible for the solvency of the institution in which they owned a fractional interest, meaning that if the bank failed, they got a capital call, meaning they had to stuff up more money. This sword of Damocles was called double liability. So patterns of thought and speech were likewise different from today's. The abstraction we moderns call the economy had not yet been conceived. People spoke of good times and bad, of boom and bust, but not yet of a macroeconomic whole to be observed, much less to be managed. In the 1960s, a fellow named John Copperthwaite, a British governor of Hong Kong, refused to allow the collection of economic statistics lest the bureaucrats misappropriate that information in the service of governmental macroeconomic manipulation. The very word statistics, by the way, derives from the state or the government. So Wilson and Harding had precious few data at their disposal, even if they were inclined to implement the cyclical policies that were yet unimagined. So ill-lit was the economic landscape that the Republican Party seemed unaware that a depression was in progress when it convened in June 1920 to nominate Warren Harding as its presidential candidate. So the depression had started, according to modern dating methods in January of 1920, and the GOP, which had every interest in hanging the bad times on the incumbent Wilsonians, was unaware of the existence of this downturn when they convened in June. At least the platform writers neglected to mention the economy in their list of charges against the incumbent Wilson administration. The economy in government was the only context in which the GOP chose to employ the E word. Business activity, as I say, had peaked some 5 months earlier. So by the time the Depression ran its official course in July 1921, industrial production had plunged by 31% and commodity prices by 40%. Maximum joblessness ranged between 2 million and 6 million out of a non-farm labor force of 31.5 million. That was a range of estimates presented at a national conference on unemployment convened by Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover after all of the dust had settled. So notable bankrupts in this affair included the CEO of General Motors, whose name was Billy Durant, and an Army veteran returned from World War I. He had started a men's clothing store, and his name was Harry S. Truman. Some today, including the eminent economist Christina Romer, argue that the 1920-21 downturn was little more than a recessionary bump in the road. A contemporary congressional inquest, however, concluded with respect to commodity prices that the debacle of 1920-21 was without parallel in American history. The bitterly sardonic lyrics of the 1921 hit tune, "Ain't We Got Fun," would also seem to attest to the seriousness of the situation. You've probably heard this line, there's nothing sure, the rich get richer and the poor get children. Now, well, both lyrics actually in the tune. Both are correct. Booms not only precede busts, some say, I say, they also cause them. So it was in 1920 that combatants of the Great War had fought on the cuff. They spent more than they raised in taxes, and they borrowed or printed the difference. They abandoned the gold standard almost as soon as the shooting started. The result was an inflation that distorted both prices and judgment. Inflation ravaged America too, though this country entered the war 2.5 years after the first shots were fired, and the Wilson administration never abandoned at least the letter of the gold standard. Consumer prices rose at double digits in 1916, 17, and 18. In 1918, they're up almost 20%. So history then taught that peace would bring deflation, meaning falling prices. Such had been the experience of Britain after the Napoleonic Wars, and such had been America's experience after the Civil War. When governments stopped printing money for the very purpose of destroying life and property, prices, they said, would certainly tumble. They did not tumble. The long-thwarted American consumer celebrated the end of wartime stringency by making the cash registers sing. By the fall of 1919, plants were operating at full tilt, raw materials were unobtainable except at markups to quoted prices, and delivery times were being pushed further and further out into the future. A sensible pair of shoes had cost you $3 before the war, now they fetched $12. Wages couldn't seem to keep up with prices, nor prices with costs. Responding to flyaway prices, producers and consumers took actions they would presently come to regret. General Motors built itself the world's biggest headquarter building in Detroit, about $20 million worth. National Citibank, today's Citibank, even then accident-prone, lent not wisely but too well against the inflated collateral of Cuban sugar. Farmers borrowed to purchase marginal acres of cropland, which they then planted from fence post to fence post. The inflationary music didn't stop all at once, but decrescendoed in the fall of 1919. On November 3rd, 1919, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York lifted its discount rate, that is the rate it charged in loans, so to speak, to banks. It raised that rate to 4.75% from 4%. You've probably read about the 2 or 3 years worth of dithering on the part of the Federal Reserve, whether it today should raise its invisible federal funds rate by 1/4 of 1%. This was 3/4 of 1% at one gulp. Ah, those were interest rates. Uh, Over the next 3 weeks after that increase, the Dow gave up almost 13% of its value. In January 1920, the Fed tightened once more, this time all the way up to 6. Commodity prices started to soften in March of 1920, with the Japanese silk market being an early deflationary sign and bellwether. You know, they say that globalization is something new. Well, it's not true. Markets were then linked worldwide. The price declines were immediate and in many cases severe, though they failed to seize the national attention. Certainly they made no deep impression on the still wet behind the ears Federal Reserve. It had been founded in 1913 and didn't get going really through the end of 1914. The governors said this at the end of August 1920, quote, "There are already indications that the transition period is nearing a halt and that an improvement in the general situation is in sight." Close quote. They were exactly 1 year early. Benjamin Strong, then the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, was a year prescient. In a letter to the monetary economist Edwin Kemmerer early in 1919, he predicted exactly how deflationary events would unfold. Interest rates would be going up as the Fed extricated itself from the untenable position of suppressing the cost of the Treasury's wartime borrowing. Prices would be falling and business activity contracting. And here is what Strong prophesied, quote, "I believe that this period will be accompanied by a considerable degree of unemployment, but not for very long, and that after a year or two of discomfort, some losses, some disorders caused by unemployment, we will emerge with an almost invincible banking position, with prices more nearly at competitive levels with other nations, and be able to exercise a wide and important influence in restoring the world to normal and livable conditions. One must have a theory of these things to work on, and at least the courage to practice and state it." Close quote. So implicit in the theory of this Federal Reserve official was faith in the self-correcting nature of markets and in the strength and resilience of American finance. He believed that the depression he foresaw was a necessary evil. Wages, like prices, were too high and had to come down. They would fall to sustainable levels sooner or later. If the Federal Reserve could give them a helpful shove, so much the better for the timely return to a sustainable prosperity. There was no mistaking the American zeitgeist or spirit of that time for the era of good feelings. 1919 brought race riots, a wave of strikes in the heavily unionized labor force, a Red Scare, and an influenza pandemic. In 1920 came Prohibition and the unmasking of a swindler named Ponzi. On September 16, 1920, a terrorist explosion on Wall Street killed 38 and maimed 100. Later that month, a grand jury heard evidence into the Chicago White Sox's alleged fixing of the 1919 World Series. By 1921, according to the contemporary reckoning of the English economist Thomas Gregory, the world was, quote, "nearer collapse than at any time since the downfall of the Roman Empire." And there was Prohibition. Can you imagine going through this sober? Well, still, the successive administrations of Woodrow Wilson and Warren G. Harding hewed to the policies of economic non-intervention. With Wilson, it was a case of laissez-faire by accident. In the war, his administration had rationed and commandeered and regimented without ideological compunction. After the war, it had attacked inflation by the ancient quack remedy of vilifying the producers who charged the objectionable prices. The president was quoted as saying in the summer of 1919, "I am perfectly sure that the government has got to control everything that everybody needs and uses." Well, nobody knows what Wilson might have done if he had kept his health. The stroke he suffered in September 1919 incapacitated both him and his administration. It presently seemed to the journalist Ray Stannard Baker as if our government had gone out of business. Not so the Fed, which continued to turn the screws. In June 1920, it imposed a 7% discount rate, up from 6%. Adjusted for the deflation of prices and wages, that 7% felt more like 15. Now, in San Jose, do they have, does the weather forecast on the radio tell you the real feel, how much it actually feels like outside? Well, this is kind of a real feel interest rate. If prices are falling, the posted rate of interest feels as if it were much more difficult to pay because the prices you are receiving are lower. So a 15% real feel rate was indeed quite something to work with. The chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, also named Harding, no relation, gave speech after speech proclaiming that better times were at hand. This is a Federal Reserve staple. This was not despite falling prices, but, and here is a change, but because of falling prices. The Boston Fed, in a cheerful March 1921 comment, echoed Harding, said the Boston Federal Reserve Board Bank, "We have been witnessing two important conditions precedent to the laying of enduring foundations for the future stability of business, namely liquidation and deflation." And what did that mean? It meant that in the eyes of the Federal Reserve, what had to occur to set the course of sustainable prosperity was the selling of things that were held in inventory at unreasonable prices and a general decline in prices and in wages. These things today would, of course, be heresy. To many people, those particular foundations seem neither necessary nor stable. Critics, even then, critics included broadly the political left. Senator Robert L. Owen, Democrat of Oklahoma, who had shepherded the Federal Reserve bill through the upper house of Congress, the economist Irving Fisher, Gustav Cassell, and John Maynard Keynes, and the comptroller of the currency, John Skelton Williams, who, as an ex officio governor of the Fed, bitterly criticized the high interest rates for which he himself had voted. Tucked away in the archives of the comptroller, this man Williams, is a newspaper cartoon which the comptroller did not draw but might well have inspired. The scene is an operating room out of the blood bucket era of orthopedic medicine. An unanesthetized patient labeled business stares bug-eyed at the doctor, ticketed Federal Reserve, as this doctor begins to amputate his right leg. It is more than concerning to the patient, again, business, that the doctor is oblivious to the ingrown toenail, designated speculation and high prices, for which the patient had evidently sought treatment. "Gosh, doc," implores business, "couldn't you cut it off down a little nearer to the toe?" Well, it's funny when you see it. You gotta see. In a speech to the United States Chamber of Commerce in May 1930, 10 years later, President Herbert Hoover made bold a claim that, quote, "For the first time in the history of great slumps, we have no substantial reduction in wages," close quote. That was Hoover's boast at the start of the Great Depression of 1930s. In a later totting up of data compiled by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the AFL, the labor union, head of the National Organization of Organized Labor, found truth in that assertion. In 1921, 92% of reporting firms had cut wages. 92%. In 1930, only 7% had. The result, according to new research by the UCLA economist Lee Ohanian, was a rise in real manufacturing wages in 1930 and disastrous drop in manufacturing hours worked. So if prices are falling but wages remain the same, necessarily profit margins contract, and if a business is suffering either diminished profits or losses, it is much less inclined to hire and much more inclined to reduce the hours of people it keeps on the payroll. So just how paradoxically enlightened were the supposed primitive ideas of 1920 and 1921 did not become evident until after the 1930s had run their course. Downwardly mobile wage rates were one such constructive feature of this forgotten depression. It helps to recall that the gold value of the dollar was fixed. It was not within the Federal Reserve's power to raise up prices and/or wages by conjuring new dollar bills, even if it had wanted to. Prices and wages were expected to do the adjusting if adjustment was called for. As prices were deflating, so should wages fall, reasoned the business and financial community. The labor community did not concur. Wages would not and should not fall, Samuel Gompers, president of the American Federation of Labor, countered. He pointed out that working people had not yet regained the purchasing power they had lost in the war during that terrible inflation. The fact is that wage rates did drop in the early 1920s, though by how much exactly is unknown. The decline was steep enough to prevent the evisceration of business profits that would otherwise have occurred, and that in the 1930s did occur. That, along with its complement, mass unemployment. The restoration of profits at lower levels of prices and wages made a signal contribution to the blooming recovery of the early 1920s. So Warren G. Harding won the 19 presidential election on the promise of less government in business and more business in government. Like his Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, Harding favored sound money, low taxes, and the free play of wages and prices, said the cheerful ex-newspaperman in his inaugural address. We must face a condition of grim reality, charge off our losses, and start afresh. It is the oldest lesson of civilization. The Depression was 15 months old when Harding moved into the White House. Mellon, banker, industrialist, and a director of no fewer than 60 corporations, this is Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, knew full well how hard were the times. He subsequently described the crisis of 1921 as the most severe such downturns in American annals. To President Harding and to him, it was the very gravity of the situation that demanded reduced federal spending and lower tax rates, and in Mellon's personal view, lower interest rates too. In none of the 12 years leading up to 1912 had the federal government spent as much as $700 million. Now, had it laid out that much and more in annual interest payments on the federal debt, it was a shocking state of affairs to people who fancy themselves conservative financiers. So to staunch the gushing red ink, President Harding personally went to the Senate to make his case against a pending bill to pay a multi-billion-dollar soldier's bonus, a bonus to the returning veterans from France. Mellon pushed for elimination of the wartime excess profits tax and a halving in the top income tax rate on personal incomes to 32% from 64%. Uncounted millions of unemployed people were pleading for work. Tax cuts and spending reductions were the means to providing it. Such was the bedrock of the Harding-Mellon economic plan. The president told the senators that stabilized finance and well-established confidence are both essential to restored industry and commerce, and that to pass legislation that would cause the Treasury to mail government checks to millions of their demobilized constituents would be a mistake. And Harding prevailed. Though the phrase new normal was unspoken in 1921, people did wonder if the world had lost its bearings. The president of the DuPont company, even then a great chemical giant in America, asked the stockholders the following in the annual letter of 1921. You are anxious to know whether this represents a new era of reduced business or whether the depression will quickly pass. Earnings per share had plunged to $2.35 in 1921 from $17 in 1920. Inventories and the payroll had both been chopped in half. DuPont's chief executive blamed not some new era, but an old-fashioned cycle of inventory building. As DuPont had sold its inventories, all the stuff that's waiting in the warehouse to be used in production, as DuPont had sold its inventory, so had its customers and suppliers reduced theirs. It stood to reason that the rebuilding of inventories would prove a potent stimulant, which indeed it did. Mellon immediately did not immediately get the tax cut he wanted. But the Federal Reserve, beginning in the spring of 1921, did begin to implement the interest rate reductions for which he had quietly lobbied. To objections that a 0.5% reduction in a 7% lending rate would incite speculation, Mellon replied that the country could use a little speculation. By the time the stock market scraped bottom late in the summer of 1921, scores of companies were valued at less than their working capital, according to the Wall Street Journal. And large numbers of industrial companies, said that newspaper, were selling at 1/3 of their intrinsic value. Coca-Cola, in which the punters had earlier speculated as a play on the new prohibition law, was one such bargain. Coca-Cola was in a kind of a newfangled concept business. It wasn't exactly established yet, but it seemed to have prospects. Only 500,000 shares were outstanding, and at $19 each, they provided a stock market capitalization of less than $10 million. I'm not sure where Coke is valued today, but I think the operative word is billion. Anyway, the company was valued at what would prove to be, for your business majors, proved to be just 1.7 times 1922 earnings. And they paid a yield of 5.25%. Now, does anyone have a Google can tell me where Coke is valued today? Might check, say, Yahoo Finance and see how it's valued and what the market capitalization is and what the price earnings multiple is. I bet you'll find a big contrast between this market cap and the price earnings ratio of less than 2 and the dividend yield of more than 5. Gillette Safety Razor Company, which was selling as many blades and razors in 1921 as it had in 1920, was quoted at a little more than 5 times forward profits, and it paid a dividend yield of almost 10%. Radio Corporation of America, not yet revealed as the great growth stock of the 20s, could be purchased in the market for about as much as the company would earn in profits in 1923, $1.50 a share. So this was an unmedicated stock market bottom, unmedicated in the sense the Federal Reserve was not in there coaching and coaxing and liquefying and printing money and telling us that we ought to buy. So the springtime thaw in Federal Reserve interest rate policy was by no means the only or most important source of monetary stimulus. Sky-high real American interest rates, that is inflation adjusted, and rock bottom American stock and bond and real estate values pulled in money from abroad, meaning gold being money. Between January and July 1920, foreign gold augmented the American gold stock by some $400 million to a grand total of $3 billion. Optimists hoped that 5 million more would be coming in before the great importation ran its course. By the close of 1923, almost $1 billion had landed. President Harding had aimed to restore business confidence, and foreigners expressed their confidence by sending money. Over and done with in 18 months, the Depression of 1920-21 was the beau ideal of a deflationary slump, it seems to me. The banking system survived without a single major failure, even if certain eminent New York institutions wobbled and hundreds of country banks did close. Though painful, the Depression was hardly pointless. It rebalanced costs and prices and corrected the investment errors of the inflationary boom. A powerful job-filled recovery followed by 1922 industrial production. In 1922, industrial production leapt by 26%. Domestic auto and truck production by 63%. The Wall Street Journal in a New Year's Day 1923 retrospective had this to say: from practically all angles, 1922 can be recorded as the renaissance of prosperity. Contemporaries mainly withheld their applause. The virtue of downward flexibility in wage rates was not so obvious to the many whose wages had declined. There was, of course, no federal safety net. Then to a year and a half's worth of business contraction seemed unnecessarily protracted. There was as yet no Great Depression against which to draw a favorable comparison. The Great Depression, of course, was on for more than 3 years, and its aftermath for, well, more than 3 years. The September 1921 economic review of what is today Citibank had this to say about the Depression. They seem most ungrateful. It is a pity the agony must be so long drawn out, a pity that inevitable adjustments cannot be quickly made with intelligent comprehension and a cooperative spirit. That's Citibank. Well, stability became the public policy watchword of the mid and late 1920s. People were tired of the ups and downs of what they deemed to be a primitive form of capitalism. They wanted to inculcate the notions of stability, so they did so. They tried to. Irving Fisher, the economist from Yale, talked up the virtues of active monetary management. By buying and selling the correct volumes of government securities, said he, a central bank might keep prices on an even keel. And he declared the need of our time is stabilization. In the final quarter of the 19th century, average prices had fallen in response to the rise of labor-saving technology. After all, if it costs less to make things, should it not cost less to buy them? The world had advanced in economic understanding since then, so the stabilizationists insisted the price level, if one could accurately calculate such a thing, must be made to stand still, whatever the underlying decline in the cost of production. You know, we all kind of casually talk about the price level. We talk about the rate of inflation or the absence of inflation. But when you get down to the homely details of calculating a price index, you are rather in awe of the people who try to do it and wonder how they do it. Every once in a while, I'm reminded of this. Most recently, on a trip, I packed everything except a toothbrush. One does this occasionally, at least I do. And it wasn't just any toothbrush, it was like electrical toothbrush. It was a $10 pretty great toothbrush. And I go down to the concierge of the hotel in the morning and say, you know, can I have a toothbrush? Helpfully covering my mouth. And he hands me this antique. It's a toothbrush without a battery. And you put it in your mouth, it's like dead. So that toothbrush cost like 25 cents. My toothbrush cost 10 bucks. I would have paid 20 at that very moment. So what is the inflation in the price of toothbrushes? How much is it in the technology? How much is it in the demand or the subjective want of the consumer? How do you calculate it? And how do you calculate it beyond the decimal point to the right? Are we kidding ourselves when we say prices are up 2.13%? Huh? 2.13? How do you do that? Anyway, the stabilizationists thought that prices could be calculated, could be made into an index, and monetary policy could be managed according to that index. So when the 1920s stopped roaring, the Fed and the Hoover administration applied what they took to be the lessons of 1920-21. They didn't want that again. So the Fed lowered interest rates, it didn't raise them, and President Hoover rallied employers against wage reductions. And here is Irving Fisher again. In May 1930, the Depression was then about 6 or 8 months old, as it was dated after the fact. The stock market had crashed. It had begun to recover a little bit. And here is what Irving Fisher said in May of 1930. It seems manifest that thus far, the difference between the present comparatively mild business recession and the severe depression of 1920-21 is like that between a thunder shower and a tornado. Well, 7 years after this colossal misjudgment came one of the wisest of the contemporary postmortems of the Hoover policies. The authors of a book called Banking in the Business Cycle, published in 1937, identified the essential flaw of Fisher's argument. By propping up a price level that, owing to cheapening production costs, would otherwise have fallen, the Fed in the 1920s had implemented a kind of invisible inflation. That is to say, it had propped up prices that, on account of human progress, ingenuity, and the advancing techniques of production, ought to have dwindled. So doing, it had disturbed the economic architecture in ways that led to a bust. The end result of what was probably the greatest price stabilization experiment in history proved to be simply the greatest and worst depression. So these critics judged, I think, correctly. In 1923, Keynes told a British audience that, quote, an individualist society left to itself does not work well or even tolerably. The more troublous the times, the worse does a laissez-faire system work. Well, the story of the Forgotten Depression, it seems to me, rather disproves that contention, or at least challenges it. Mistaken though he was in his reading of the American record, Keynes and Fisher, too, won the battle of public policy and of ideas. Today, in place of the gold standard, the world has adopted the PhD standard, discretionary monetary policy by a former tenured economics faculty. Not that they're all bad, by any means. They're nice people. Prices and wages, goes the modern theory, must always rise, never fall, which policy takes the curious name of price stability. They define price stability as a 2% per annum, as measured, 2% per annum rise. Over the course of that 2% per annum exercise in price stability, by the way, the consumer price index would quintuple over the life of a healthy lifespan. Not much remains the same in America nearly a quarter century after the events of 1920-21. The former gold dollar today is weightless, undefined. The liability of a bank stockholder for the solvency of an institution that no longer pertains. With Dodd-Frank, it's perhaps not too much to say that the largest institutions in America have been functionally nationalized. This thing we call the economy, this abstraction, which the contemporaries of Wilson Harding knew nothing, it came to life in the 1930s, and through the textbooks of Paul Samuelson has, I guess, gained a kind of immortality. And it has come to seem somehow almost tangible. We speak of the economy as something that we could see, touch, smell, measure, and of course, we think, manage. The people have changed, and so has their government. Empathy has infused American public policy. In a speech on unemployment in 1921, Harding related that in the best of times, 1.5 million members of the American working population were unemployed. And he added this: the figures are astounding only because we are 100 million, and this parasite percentage will always be with us. Parasite percentage? Well, not only would a 21st century American president not utter the word parasite, he or she would not think it. Now, Mitt Romney did come close, but he didn't say it. And he isn't president. It would not be a matter of not daring to think it. It would be simply not occur to the chief executive to form the thought. In 2013, a report by the Cato Institute found that welfare paid more than a minimum wage job in 35 states, and that in 13 states it paid more than $15 an hour. Wage flexibility, which contributed more than a little to the brisk work of the 1920-21 slump, is not the outstanding feature of 21st century American economic life. So the price mechanism, which to me is the hero of 1920-21, that affair, is thriving in the digital world. Witness eBay, witness Uber, but less so in the financial world. The 21st century Fed, freed from all constraints of the gold standard, has taken to sponsoring bull markets, that is to say, talking them up and doing its bit to ensure their long life and prosperity. By raising up the prices of stocks, bonds, and real estate, the central bankers hope to infuse Main Street with the riches of Wall Street. It seems not to occur to them, but by lifting or attempting to lift aggregate demand, they are likewise lifting aggregate supply. You've heard of this gimmick. The Fed some years ago announced that it was going to engineer a rise in consumption, aggregate demand, through the agency of what the economists call the portfolio balance channel. The idea went something like this, that if the price of your house, of your stocks, if your bonds, of your farm, if it went up, then you would be more likely to spend. What never was enunciated was the truism that the very financial stimuli that would cause the rise in stock prices or real estate prices would also lead to business investment. For example, very low borrowing costs, which we certainly have today for corporations anyway, have been instrumental in financing the great boom in oil and gas fracking. So instead of paying $4 a gallon, you pay 2 something per gallon, and you heat your home more cheaply. And we mostly like that. We civilians do. The Federal Reserve now is confronted with falling prices for energy that contribute an outsized downward draft in the measured rate of consumer price inflation. The Fed wants a rate of inflation of 2% a year. It says that's stable. But it's getting much less of that because, in good part, because of the abundance of energy financed in no small measure by the Fed's own policies of stimulus. So there is a reciprocity in financial things. There is supply and demand. There are assets and liabilities. And by stimulating one side of the balance sheet or one side of the income statement, something happens reciprocally on the other. The Fed seems not to have confronted that homely set of facts. Easy money has financed many things, including many skyscrapers rising in San Francisco, New York, and Dallas. The question is whether the investments put in place through artificially low interest rates are investments that will pay. As we say on Wall Street, we'll know more in 10 years. So the great economist Friedrich Hayek criticized the pretensions of economic science in a brilliant 1974 lecture, for which indeed he won the Nobel Prize lecture. He would likely have no high opinion of the econometric models that in 2005 and 6 and 7 failed to detect the biggest cyclical financial event in the professional lives of the model builders. Did you know that the mathematical models by which the Fed attempts to forecast the economic future do not take account of the financial sector of the economy? So when banks lent hand over fist against the most dubious collateral of subprime mortgages, the Fed was none the wiser. Then came 2008, and then came the difficulty of finding work. So when I think of the Fed and its models, I recall a New York City blizzard that wasn't. This was in January of this year. It was on a Friday. The weather people had forecast the greatest snowstorm in New York since the arrival of the Dutch in the 17th century. It was okay by me. I always root for blizzards. I was beside myself with excitement. I love snow. And my wife and I made reservations at the restaurant with the very, very best window. And we took our places Monday when the storm was to have hit, and took our places and ordered a drink and expectantly gazed out the window. As the hour passed by, we couldn't help but notice that it wasn't snowing. And on reflection, one considers the pretensions of economic forecasting with the science of meteorology and the fallibility of both. How many observations, different observations of more or less similar wind and patterns and temperature gradients does big data crunching, weather forecasting, how many observations might they have on such a storm as that which crept up on New York City? I dare say many. Observations more or less like those, probably hundreds of thousands or millions. How many observations do our economists have of an event such as 2008, in which through the single greatest failure of judgment and credit and financial management, the most terrible economic downturn in lifetimes of several generations occurred? Well, they have an observation of one, N of one. And yet we listen most respectfully to the econometricians talk about the future. Whatever you think you know about the future, you know as much as they do. And I think that we are all on approximately the same level of knowledge about tomorrow in finance and in economics. I'm keenly aware of this. I climb into the back seat of a cab, and somebody will have seen me years ago on Wall Street Week or something, and the cab driver will flatteringly ask about something having to do with like where interest rates are going, and I will confess that he can search me, but I actually don't know that. And if a plumber or an orthodontist were in the back of the cab, and if he asked that individual a question about his or her craft or profession, I dare say that the plumber or orthodontist would have a definitive answer. So Wall Street, in case you're contemplating a career there, is forever intriguing and forever humbling. And if the Federal Reserve would understand about the latter part, we would all be better off. So, no, the policies of Wilson and Harding seem not especially to the liking of 21st century America. That alone does not render them obsolete, I think. Something like austerity well served some of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, in the wake of the Great Recession. In telling contrast to Greece, the Baltics chose sound money and fiscal balance as the cure for what ailed them. Having suffered under Soviet rule, the people had no intention of moving any distance back to the past or away from orthodox market economics. They lacked faith in state-directed investment or its policies to maintain demand through accommodative policies in fiscal and monetary matters. If I were asked, and I have been asked, what America can learn from the experience of the 1920s, I would reply principles. Principle number one is the primacy of Adam Smith's invisible hand, or the price mechanism. Imperfect, to be sure, as all human institutions are, but a far sight better than prices confected from people on high. In Harding's time, the definition of money was inflexible. It was defined as a weight of a metal, principally gold, while prices and wages were, to a greater or lesser degree, flexible. Today, money is famously undefined, while the average of prices and the average of wages are, to a greater or lesser degree, inflexible. When imbalances arise, we fiddle with interest rates and exchange rates as opposed to addressing the relevant microeconomic dislocations, like too much mortgage debt or too many houses at the wrong price being recent examples. The second principle, seems to me, is that individuals should bear the responsibility for financial outcomes. Too big to fail and Dodd-Frank would have been incomprehensible to, for example, Andrew Mellon. In the capitalism he knew, the stockholders who earned the dividends also bore the losses. It's one thing to take risks. It's quite another to bear them. Principle number three is that too much knowledge can be a dangerous thing. I wonder if our aspiring Republican presidential candidates wouldn't consider taking up the call for a trial blackout of government-issued macroeconomic data. Just a brief one. Harding in America and Copperthwaite in Hong Kong worked wonders in the data darkness. An author named Guido Magno wrote a history of medicine entitled The Healing Hand, Man and Wound in the Ancient World. It's a chronicle of the cycles of insight and ignorance concerning medical practices in ancient Mesopotamia and India and Greece and Rome. A friend of mine once heard Majno summarize his findings as follows. You know, said the author, it was not really until the last year of the Second World War, with the widespread dissemination of penicillin, that if you suffered an open flesh wound, you would have been advised to let someone touch you rather than let nature take its course. In the decades since the Forgotten Depression and subsequent roaring recovery, doctors of economics have prescribed more and heavier interventions. Wholesale money printing, doing business under the clinical term quantitative easing, has come to seem almost orthodox. The triumph of sound money and of market-determined prices is the not-so-distant, in the not-so-distant American past, invites the suggestion that we today allow economic nature to take its course. So that's my speech. I would be delighted to talk to you about this or about the here and now on Wall Street. But as my crackling voice reminds me, I should probably get a gulp of water, which is a great opportunity to sort of raise his hand. And if you would...
let's give the speaker a round of applause.
Well, yeah, right.
We have questions. I have a microphone. If someone want to take the microphone at the other end. Lydia, who has a question? All right, Fred.
I think you asked about Coca-Cola.
Yes.
Yeah, share price is $40, market cap $174 billion.
It's doing okay. It's not even good for you. Part of the charm.
During the Great Recession of 2008, the policymakers appeared to be truly fearful of a total financial collapse.
Yes.
Had the Fed not done anything, do you have an opinion of what the response financially would have been on Wall Street and in the banking system?
It is a question that has been frequently asked. It was a very good question and never once answered. And the answer that one hears is likely to reflect more the political prejudices of the interlocutor than of anything resembling settled science. I'll give you two thoughts. One is on the side of those who insisted that intervention was necessary lest disaster truly ensue. And that answer has to do with the nature of these institutions as they have developed in a regime of public subsidy. My publication in 2006 published a front-page piece, the headline of which was "Over the Cliff with Morgan Stanley." And we observed that the balance sheet of Morgan Stanley showed what we know on Wall Street as leverage of 40 to 1, meaning there was $40 of asset. For every $40 of asset, there's $1 of capital, of loss-absorbing capital. Not much had to go wrong before Morgan Stanley would have been in great trouble. In fact, Morgan Stanley proved to be the, I think, the single largest taker of federal financial subsidy in 2008 and 9, I think. Morgan Stanley was the front of the line. So that was the state of play from the era of the 19th century and the 20th century into the 30s. Stockholders were responsible for outcomes. Individuals were, and that spirit of that, if you cut the dividend, you board laws, that spirit prevailed into, I think, the 50s and the 60s. Come the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the partnership form of organization began to disappear on Wall Street. Partnership form of organization means that the general partners of a brokerage house, for example, are responsible personally for the debts of the firm. If the firm fails, not only must they stump up what they own in stock to make good the losses, but they are at risk for losing their homes and everything they own. So all that went away. And as that went away, and as Too Big to Fail came in the 1980s, the personalities and the managements of these firms changed utterly. And they became, I say, they became much more dangerous to all living things in and around Wall Street, as far west as San Jose. So that's on the side of intervention was a must. On the other side is the argument that if we never let what we might call financial and economic equity take its course, will we not just have one big government bank? And what are the political consequences of letting the capitalists earn the dividends and the taxpayers bear the losses? Again, this distinction between taking and bearing risk. The big shots took the risk, and many of them made a lot of money when the times are good, and we, the people, bear the losses. One could argue, I think I would argue, that the risks attached to that are far greater than any mere financial damage that might have resulted from the sequential failures of Morgan Stanley and AIG.
My question to you is about about you said about GM's how GM managed to about the recession. How did they do in the 1920s, and how would you compare it to what they did in 2008?
I can tell you more about the 20s than the aughts. I'm not. I don't follow GM very closely, although we know what happened to financially. It was, of course, in the government's hands. In the 1920s, the GM had, I'll put it this way, General Motors had a much more difficult time of it in 1921 than it had in any year of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Billy Durant, the flamboyant entrepreneur who founded it and never did become really corporate, went personally broke, and GM never did go broke, but it was a very close run thing for the company. It had a great deal of inventory. It got into sidelines in tractor production and the like, and it had this $20 million albatross of a headquarters building in Detroit. So it was a long time digging out. It did dig out, and as soon as like the fall of 1921, there were labor shortages in Detroit. And as I mentioned, I think auto and truck production positively boomed in the early 20s. In 2008, General Motors became in effect an award of the state. So I would say that in so many ways, we people, I think, especially people in California, who the state was founded on optimism and is the headquarters of American technological ingenuity, people assume that that knowledge advances and that techniques improve and that the world gets better and that progress in material things is almost unstoppable. Well, in finance, progress is cyclical. In science, it's cumulative, right? We stand on the shoulders of giants, and in technology and science. In finance, we keep stepping on the same rakes. We do learn, but it almost seems as if human beings are engineered not to be good with money. Maybe we'd be too rich. If you go through there's a kind of a parlor trick that illustrates what might have been in human wealth. If you go back to the death of Cleopatra and you say, okay, one of her retainers had the grace and the generosity of spirit to deposit $100, if there were dollars. $100, it's a 50 BC, in a 2% per annum certificate of deposit in the Bank of Eternity, all right? How much would that deposit be worth today? Just $100 over 2,000 and something years, compounded at the simple rate of 2% per annum. How much would it be worth for every human being on the planet? About, how much would you say? it gets? $1,000, 10,000, a million, 5 billion. Do the math. So General Motors then and now, the cars get better, right? The technology is wondrous. The company goes broke when in 1921, in the 30s, managements didn't. So progress in finance is a very, very questionable thing. And if we were so much better in finance, we'd have that $5 billion per head. As it is, we have less. Speaking for myself.
Question? Hands? Anyone?
There's one up here.
All right.
With our current monetary base and derivative exposure, won't the quarter interest rate rise whether the Fed increases it or whether the market forces them to be cataclysmic?
The question, I barely heard, perhaps I'll repeat the question. Given the structure of things, given the exposures to derivatives,
To derivatives and the monetary base will...
right, would not even a 0.25% rise in rate of interest be calamitous for us? And I think not. Interest rates, market interest rates, as you suggested in your question, are independent of the Fed, have in fact been going up. At the start of this year, at junk bonds, right? They are promises to pay money issued by corporations judged to be not investment grade, speculative grade companies, companies that have really not reached the point of established financial strength. Those companies were paying 5.25% to borrow in January. Now they're paying 8%. So that's an immense increase in the cost of borrowing when the Fed has done nothing. You find much more dramatic increases in borrowing costs throughout the so-called, they call them emerging markets now, from Turkey, Indonesia, Russia, China, of course. Those rates have gone up dramatically. Brazil. Even government bond yields are a little bit different, but in many different cases, rates have gone up, and the world still turns. I think that the implied in your question is a very important point, which is that a long-running experiment in the production of dollar bills and in the suppression of natural interest rates brings about a structure of things, an architecture of finance, an architecture of employment that is apparently dependent upon more of the same. And then if you take that away, isn't that going to isn't that going to be trouble? And I think the answer to that is yes. We don't know how much trouble. We don't know where exactly the trouble will be. We're looking at, for example, at something as humdrum as office buildings. Okay, ultra-low borrowing costs have in many parts of the country fostered a great boom in construction of office towers. Now, it's good for people who rent, but it's not good necessarily for people who lend the money to the developers and who own the equity in the buildings. They face financial loss if rents fall and if a recession develops because of financial troubles associated with the end of this experiment with money printing. So I think I would agree with the spirit of your question, and I would agree with, I would not characterize it as disastrous or calamitous. I say it might be very messy, but it's nothing we won't recover from.
Mark, I see your hand up. No? You always have a question.
I appreciated your talk very much because it seems to be questioning the Keynesian paradigm of medicating an economy. Have you seen much response that would actually encourage you that perhaps your lessons from what you've written about are changing people's perceptions of what the right way to deal with a a recession would be?
No. But how nice of you to ask. I have, it's, you know, the book has been, has won plaudits in the places you'd expect it to have won them, and brickbats in the places you'd expect those to be thrown. The interventionist school of economic thinking has by and large not engaged. One might have hoped for, you know, a pistols at dawn kind of challenge from the Brookings Institution or something, but or even an unfriendly letter from Janet Yellen, but nothing of the kind. But I live in hope, and you're kind, as I say, you're kind to ask.
Any other questions? All right.
You said that the Fed has one measurement point for predicting an economy, more or less.
Well, it has a model, a mathematical, they call it dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. I can imagine a bunch of people in lab coats pouring numbers into this thing, and out pops, the GDPs get up 3.7% in the next quarter, and so it's a mathematical model.
Okay. It seems like they only have one remedy, and that's to increase the currency supply always, either through printing or hedonic adjustments, but in some way they're making it seem as if borrowing more money from our grandchildren is beneficial to us today. How do they rationalize that?
Well, I wish they would think more about that. So you're right. Low rates constitute invitation to borrow and to spend, right? So, but think of what low rates mean, you know, fundamentally. What low rate? As I see it, very, very low, artificially low rates do two things. One, they pull consumption forward from the future. If you can afford to buy a car only with 0% financing, that means you're not going to buy one soon after you've got this one, right? So to a degree, consumption is pulled forward. And there's another and subtler consequence of these policies, low rates and money printing, and that is that failure is pushed back, is deferred. And one of the paradoxes of capitalism is that you need failure as much as success. You know, The Onion, of all places, in 2005 had this funny piece on Radio Shack. And kind of had one of these fake interviews with the CEO, and the CEO said, I have no idea why I have this desk to sit behind. How do we sell enough extension cords and strobe lights to keep this place in business? So that was Radio Shack in the digital age, and sure enough, it filed for bankruptcy like 10 years later. And it was sustained in part through very low borrowing costs. So that's good for the employees of Radio Shack, right? They get to keep their jobs, but it's not good necessarily for someone who has a better idea and who would have put the storefronts to better use, or the employees to better use. So it seems to me that capitalism, like the forest floor, requires, you know, death and regeneration as well as prospering in life. So you need all these things. And Japan is a great example of a place that has had nothing but stimulus and low rates and is kind of a petrified forest. What we need is the Americans need a living forest. And it sounds like a damn political speech, so I'm going to get a plane, I think.
One more question.
Is there some way that we can estimate the natural rate of interest, what interest rates would be if not for Federal Reserve manipulations and taxes?
This notion of a natural rate of interest infuses the economic literature. And I don't think that anyone has ever, as I understand it, I dare say many people in this room know better than I the theoretical grounding in this, but it seems to me that that the natural rate of interest would be that set by the intersection of the demand for saving and the supply of saving as opposed to bank credit, so especially central bank credit. So saving is the residual from consumption deferred or postponed. So that's a real thing, and the intersection of that real thing with the demand for the real thing might give us the natural rate of interest. I think that more or less spontaneous or kind of free-range interest rates, farm-to-table rates, are evident to a degree in various departments of the credit markets, because the Fed only influences longer dated maturities. It only influences, it doesn't control necessarily. So some portions of the corporate bond market, for example, are less under the thumb of the central bankers, but everything is influenced by it. And people have contended that even in the absence of these most muscular Federal Reserve policies, that rates would be very low. Well, I can accept that, but what I don't believe is that they would have been, as in Europe, they're less than zero. German bonds yielded about zero, or 10 years, they yielded about zero earlier this year. And these are aberrant interest rates. In the Great Depression, there were no rates so low as these. So I would say that just based upon the comparison with interest rates existing at depths of cyclical downturns in the past, compare them with these rates, we're lower. So I say that not very scientific evidence suggests at least that rates are artificially low and that the natural rate is higher. Low interest rates themselves are not especially new. Walter Bagehot in the 1850s and 60s was wont to say that he was an Englishman, so he's talking about England. He'd say, John Bull can stand anything, but he can't stand 2%, meaning that an interest rate as low as 2% would foster reckless speculation and misallocations and debt hangovers. So low rates go, certainly, the 19th century was a time of low interest rates, but what is different now about these rates, it speaks to the question of what is natural, is that superimposed on these rates are governmental sponsored efforts to raise up prices in stocks and bonds and commodities and elsewhere. And that's kind of new under the sun. That's most unnatural.
Thank you.
Yes, let's give James Grant a final round of applause.
Thank you.
And as you leave, don't forget to drop off your survey forms, and if you wish to join us at Flames, some of us will be there. Thank you very much.
Oh, you are welcome.
Enjoyed that.
Thank you for the nice introduction. Well, I'm not sure.
Yeah, let's take this off. Whoops.